If you're here, you've probably had enough of climate inaction. If you really care about climate change, you need to understand what we can do together to fight it, and why carbon taxes are not as bad as many people think. Today, we are going to investigate what a carbon tax really is. We'll show it can be designed in a way that benefits the working class, and that people support it when that's the case. We'll conclude by showing that support is even stronger for a global climate plan, a carbon price at the global level that would finance a global basic income. In this and the next video, we focus on popularizing social science. In another video, we take a more proactive approach by presenting the global climate plan proposed by the nonprofit organization Global Redistribution Advocates. Now, without further ado, let's explore the fascinating world of carbon pricing. So, what are carbon pricing and its effects? By assigning a price to CO2 emissions, the cost of products increases proportionally to their carbon content. This particularly affects the price of fossil fuels. This encourages individuals and businesses to reduce their use of fossil fuels, either by changing their equipment or adjusting their habits. Over time, this leads to a reduction in CO2 emissions. With carbon pricing, polluters pay. The larger the carbon footprint, the greater the increase in expenses. Now, you may wonder, who suffers the most from carbon pricing, the rich or the poor? In high-income countries like the UK or the US, high-income individuals have, on average, a larger carbon footprint, so they face a greater absolute increase in their expenses. However, they also tend to save more and consume more expensive products. So, in proportion to their income, carbon pricing hurts the rich less than it hurts the poor. But does this mean that carbon pricing is unfair? Not necessarily. If the revenue from a carbon tax is equally distributed among the population, it is called a carbon tax with cash transfers. In this case, with equal cash transfers, the carbon tax becomes progressive. In other words, on average, it benefits the poor and negatively impacts the rich. Let's see why.
With a carbon tax, all products that emit greenhouse gases would be taxed. For example, the price of gasoline would increase by 40 cents per gallon. With a carbon tax, companies and people pay for the greenhouse gases they emit. This pushes them to reduce their emissions. To compensate people for higher prices, the revenues of the carbon tax would be redistributed to all households, regardless of their income. Each adult would thus receive $600 per year. On average, poorer people own smaller cars, live in smaller houses, and fly less, so they use less fossil fuels than average. As they would receive the same cash transfer as everyone else, poorer people will generally gain from a carbon tax with cash transfers. Conversely, rich people will tend to lose.
By now, it should be clear that a carbon tax with cash transfers reduces CO2 emissions and benefits many people, particularly low-income households. These properties are precisely what matters the most in garnering support for a carbon tax. Multiple academic studies have shown that people are more likely to support a carbon tax when they perceive it as effective in reducing emissions, in their own interest, and fair, meaning it benefits low-income people rather than high-income people. Researcher Antoine de Chez-le-Prêtre and his co-authors conducted a survey of 40,000 people in 20 countries. The survey revealed majority support for some variant of a carbon tax in almost every single country. Support was measured on a scale ranging from strongly opposed to strongly support. In the following graphs, absolute support represents the percentage of somewhat or strongly support responses, while relative support represents the percentage of somewhat or strongly support responses among the combined support and opposed responses, excluding indifferent responses. Now let's consider the relative support based on how the revenue from the carbon tax is utilized. The only variant of the carbon tax that doesn't garner majority relative support in high-income countries is the one that doesn't specify the use of revenues. People seem to understand that this variant may disproportionately affect low-income people and the middle class. The carbon tax with cash transfers receives the second least support, but it still enjoys relative majority support in most countries, with the exception of Denmark, Germany, and France. The preferred variants are those that are clearly progressive or effective in reducing emissions, garnering 70 to 85% relative support in high-income countries. This includes a carbon tax that funds green investments, or a carbon tax with cash transfers targeting the households with the lowest income. In this case, everyone understands that it benefits low-income households. Up to now, we examined climate policies at the national level, but climate change is a global issue. So researchers asked respondents at which scale climate policy should be implemented. The global level is by far the preferred scale for implementing climate policies, far ahead of the continental, state, or local level. Now let's delve into the idea of a global carbon price that would fund equal transfers for all individuals worldwide. Check out our video that explains this proposal. Do you think this global carbon pricing garners more support than the national one? Well, on the one hand, people may prefer the global measure because it is even fairer and more effective than a national version, since it operates on a global redistribution from the richest to the poorest and reduces overall human emissions. On the other hand, support in high-income countries for a carbon pricing with global transfers is likely to be weaker than for a national version. Why? Because such a tax would benefit individuals with a carbon footprint lower than the world average, while negatively impacting high-income countries whose carbon footprint exceeds the world average. Which of the two effects dominates? In the survey of 20 countries, researchers asked people if they would support such a policy using the following question. All countries have signed the Paris Agreement that aims to contain global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius. To limit global warming to this level, there is a maximum amount of greenhouse gases we can emit globally, called the carbon budget. Each country could aim to emit less than a share of the carbon budget. To respect the global carbon budget, countries that emit more than their national share would pay a fee to countries that emit less than their share. Do you support such a policy? Do you support such a policy? In all countries, a majority of respondents answered somewhat support or strongly support to this question. In high-income countries, relative support is as high as 84%, comparable to the most popular national climate policies. You could argue that this question lacks specificity, as it does not outline how the allocation of national shares would be determined and does not specify which country would win and which would lose. What should be the share of the carbon budget allocated to each country is a thorny issue, and the researchers address that in their next question. Consistent with our other studies on this subject, this question reveals a consensus in favor of what they call the Global Climate Scheme, a system that allocates each country a share of the carbon budget proportional to its population. This equal distribution reflects the principle of every human having an equal right to emit CO2, or equivalently, an equal cash transfer, corresponding to an equal share of the carbon price revenues. Conversely, allocating the carbon budget in proportion to current emissions is the least favored option, even in wealthy countries, which nonetheless push for this approach in international negotiations. Lastly, allocations that favor low-income countries more than the equal distribution receive intermediate levels of support. These include considering historical responsibilities by granting fewer emission rights to countries that have already emitted significant amounts in the past. The Global Climate Scheme would put an end to both global warming and extreme poverty by using a global carbon price with equal cash transfers. Support for it is strong, but the questionnaire did not specify the cost to the respondents in high-income countries. This survey was the first to ask these questions, and the remarkably high level of support for global carbon pricing surprised the researchers. They were skeptical at first, thinking that perhaps people did not genuinely mean what they answered, or support could fade away once people understood the cost of the policy. To check, they conducted a follow-up survey in the United States and 4 European countries to further investigate support for the Global Climate Scheme. In these new surveys, researchers clearly stated the costs of the policy for people in high-income countries, tested the support, and checked the sincerity of this support. Curious about the results? Check out our next video.